the fading light of an early autumn evening in the bustling city of Veridale, a metropolis where the old-world charm met modern ambitions, Clara found herself at a crossroads that challenged not only her practical judgments, but also her deeply held convictions. As the amber sun dipped behind the towering, artfully renamed skyscrapers, the sounds of the city grew into a symphony of honking cars, distant chatter, and the rhythmic tapping of footsteps on aged cobblestone. It was during these moments, when the day surrendered its secrets to the night, that Clara encountered a man whose presence was as enigmatic as it was compelling. She had just helped him cross a busy thoroughfare, his form distinguished by the elegant sway of his tailored suit and the determined grip on his exquisitely carved cane. His eyes, hidden behind sleek, dark sunglasses, remained fixed on the horizon, as if guarding a treasure trove of untold stories. Yet when he spoke, his tone was anything but the uncertain murmur of one impaired by blindness. Instead, there was a cutting precision to his words. "Why do you give it back?" he demanded, his voice resonating with a calculated coolness that left no room for misunderstanding. In that charged moment, Clara's hand, still lingering on the sleeve of this mysterious stranger, trembled. Not from fear, but from a sudden, inexplicable realization that her act of kindness was about to be scrutinized. The man, later identified by those who knew him in hushed tones as Victor Calloway, exuded an air of confidence that belied any semblance of vulnerability. His gait was measured, his every movement deliberate, and yet, beneath the polished exterior lay a man who approached life as if every encounter were an experiment, a test of human character in a world governed by unspoken rules. What? The money?" he continued, tilting his face just enough to reveal a glimmer of intensity behind those opaque lenses. His insinuation was clear. Clara had, in her brief contact with him, handled something of value in a manner that defied his expectations. Clara's mind raced. She recalled countless instances when men of his ilk, refined, impeccably dressed figures who moved within the rarefied circles of the affluent, had crossed her path. They spoke with an air of entitlement, their every word measured to reflect their high station, as if they were denizens of an exclusive realm, far removed from the gritty realities of street life. Yet, despite her humble appearance, her faded dress and worn shoes a stark contrast to their immaculate attire, she had on this day, unwittingly, attracted his attention. "You dropped it," he asserted, his fingers tightening around the cane as though the slightest slip might shatter the fragile veneer of civility they both inhabited. Her throat constricted, and with a barely audible murmur, she replied, "I know." It was not merely an acknowledgement of a trivial misplacement, but rather a quiet admission of her commitment to honesty in a world that often rewarded deception. The encounter carried the weight of an unspoken test, an appraisal of her character, her worth, and perhaps even her destiny. Clara's gaze shifted momentarily toward the busy street, searching for Julian, a young man whose life, much like her own, was defined by daily struggles and fleeting hopes. Julian, her steadfast companion in a realm where survival was a delicate dance between luck and persistence, was likely concealed in a shadowed alley behind a modest bistro, diligently pursuing work that seemed as elusive as a whispered promise. For a long, suspended moment, the city held its breath. Victor Calloway remained unmoving, his figure silhouetted against the waning light as he weighed her actions. His voice, now imbued with a subtle mix of inquiry and reproach, broke the silence once more. "You picked it up, yet you returned it. Why?" The question was not one of simple curiosity. It was a challenge, a probe into the very soul of her morality. The intensity of his scrutiny made Clara's heart pound with both trepidation and an emerging sense of defiant pride. Before she could formulate a response, Victor's demeanor shifted. In a gesture as enigmatic as it was decisive, he offered a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then, as if the matter had been settled in a realm far beyond ordinary understanding, he turned and strode away, his polished shoes echoing against the pavement. In that fleeting exchange, Clara was left to grapple with the realization that she had inadvertently become part of an intricate experiment, a trial of character executed by a man who had long ago learned to measure the world in terms of calculated risks and hidden motives. Left alone amid the cacophony of city sounds, Clara felt both a sense of relief and a spark of wonder. Was this encounter a mere happenstance? Or had she just passed an unforeseen test that would alter the course of her life? Her thoughts raced back to Julian, whose presence provided a grounding counterpoint to the surreal nature of the encounter. In a narrow, dimly lit alley behind a quaint bistro, its name now changed to the Gilded Lily, Julian leaned against a worn brick wall, his fingers massaging his temple as if to ease the burden of yet another disappointing day. His eyes, shadowed with the fatigue of constant struggle, met hers with a silent question. "Nothing?" he inquired, the single word carrying the weight of countless unspoken failures. Julian's response was a resigned sigh, the sound of defeat mingled with a trace of hope. "The owner said he doesn't need another dishwasher," he explained, his tone heavy with the fatigue of persistent rejection. "He told me to try again next week." The implication was clear. The promise of a meal, the hope for a better tomorrow, was slipping further away with each passing day. The words hung in the chilly air as a testament to the harsh realities of life in Veridale, a city that, despite its glamour, was unforgiving to those caught in the undercurrents of poverty. Clara, sensing the shared weight of their struggles, sat down beside him on the cold, hard pavement. Drawing her knees close, she tried to merge her thoughts with the quiet determination that had carried her thus far. "Today, I met a blind man," she began softly, her voice trembling with the lingering echoes of her earlier encounter. "He asked me why I returned some money that I had picked up." Her admission was not just an account of an unusual event. It was a window into the complex interplay of ethics and survival that defined their existence. Julian's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from concern to cautious curiosity. "And what did he say?" he asked, his voice low, as though reluctant to disturb the fragile calm that had descended upon them. "He didn't offer an explanation, only a challenge," Clara continued, her words tinged with both confusion and a growing sense of defiance. "It was as if he expected me to fail, as if returning the money was a sign of weakness. But I did not accept his test." The admission stirred something deep within Julian, a protective fire that blended with the bitter wisdom of someone who had long been forced to fight for every scrap of dignity. As the evening progressed, the narrative of that day began to intertwine with the lives of others in unexpected ways. Victor Calloway, having left the crosswalk with the mysterious satisfaction of a test well executed, made his way toward a sleek modern office building that overlooked the sprawling urban landscape. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity, a stark contrast to the silent introspection that now occupied Victor's thoughts. With a nod to the doorman and a few measured steps, he ascended into the elevator, leaving behind the chaos of the streets for a temporary haven of order and control. Within the confines of his high-rise office, Victor's mind remained preoccupied by the encounter. The city's relentless energy, with its constant hum of money and power, seemed to fade into the background as he replayed the image of Clara, the girl who had unexpectedly defied the unwritten rules of human transactions. His trusted assistant, Elliot, lingered by the door, waiting for further instructions. Yet Victor's focus was singular, fixed on the question that now gnawed at him. How could someone so clearly in need, someone whose outward appearance spoke of hardship and despair, return money without expecting anything in return? "Clara," he muttered under his breath, the name echoing in the quiet confines of his polished office. The thought was as unsettling as it was compelling, a conundrum that defied the very logic of the world he so meticulously governed. Later that evening, as twilight deepened into night and the city's frenetic pace softened into a steady murmur, Clara found herself seated on a worn curb near a charming coffee house in a reimagined quarter of Veridale. Here, amidst the soft glow of streetlights and the murmur of passing strangers, she tried to steady the tumult of her thoughts. Her heart, still racing from the encounter with the mysterious blind man, was gradually finding a semblance of calm. It was then that she noticed him again. A man whose presence, marked by an immaculate suit and an air of deliberate sophistication, approached her with careful, measured steps. This time he carried with him a folded banknote, its crisp edges and intricate design hinting at a value far beyond what her modest means would normally afford. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice gentle yet edged with a note of urgency as he paused before her. In his outstretched hand, he held the banknote as if offering a challenge rather than a simple inquiry. "I was wondering if you could help me. I can't quite discern if this note is a 20 or a 50. His words, though spoken with calm precision, carried an undercurrent of expectation that made Clara's pulse quicken. With careful deliberation, she accepted the banknote, her fingers tracing its smooth texture. In that tactile moment, she realized with a sudden clarity that the note was not a modest sum at all. It was $100, a sum that should have easily eased her immediate burdens. Yet even as the revelation set in, Clara felt an unexpected surge of resolve. "It's 100, she whispered, her voice quivering with both determination and disbelief as she pressed the note back into his waiting palm. A heavy silence ensued, a silence loaded with questions, unspoken challenges, and a mutual recognition that this exchange was far more than a mere financial transaction. "Are you certain?" the man asked, his tone softening ever so slightly as if testing the strength of her conviction. Despite the rising pressure, Clara met his gaze with an unyielding steadiness. "Yes," she affirmed, her words clear and resolute, even as a part of her wondered at the meaning behind the entire ordeal. Then, in a gesture that defied conventional expectations, the man did not simply accept the returned note. Instead, he pressed it firmly into her hand and said, "Keep it." The insistence in his tone startled her, and for a brief second her resolve wavered. "What? I don't need it," she protested, her voice laced with indignation and a fierce sense of self-reliance. His smile, once enigmatic and encouraging, faltered into a look of quiet disappointment. "That's not true," he replied softly, as if to remind her that every act of kindness, every refusal of help, was part of a larger, intricate design that governed their intertwined lives. A tempest of emotions surged within Clara, an internal battle between the desperate need for financial relief and an unshakable belief in the value of her own integrity. With a voice that trembled but did not break, she declared, "I'm not a thief." Her words were not meant as an accusation, but rather as a testament to her steadfast commitment to honesty and self-respect, even in a world where everyone seemed to have a price. In that charged moment, as her fists clenched and her heart pounded with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability, she took a step back. Then, without another word, she turned and fled, disappearing into the maze of Veridale's shadowed streets. Victor watched her vanish around a corner, his expression inscrutable, a mask that belied the tumult of thoughts swirling within him. "She has passed," he murmured to himself, his voice carrying the cool detachment of someone who had measured the outcome of a well-orchestrated experiment. Yet even as he acknowledged her unexpected victory, the question of why someone so evidently in need would refuse a $100 bill haunted him. With a slow, deliberate motion, he removed his sunglasses, exposing eyes that held both admiration and a trace of regret. Perhaps, in his own way, he wished he had let the encounter proceed without interference. Perhaps he had hoped to see her falter, to confirm the age-old adage that, in a world of hidden costs, every kindness came with its own price. As the night deepened and the city of Veridale resumed its endless cycle of hopes and hardships, Julian found himself once again poring over his meager earnings on a tattered pay stub, the numbers a stark reminder of the impending rent due in only a few days. In the small, sparsely furnished room that served as his sanctuary from a world that rarely offered reprieve, the harsh arithmetic of survival was a constant, unyielding challenge. Yet, even as the grim reality of financial desperation loomed large, the memory of Clara's defiant act and the mysterious encounter lingered like a fragile ember of possibility. In the early hours before dawn, as the city's pulse slowed and the chaos of the day faded into a quiet, reflective lull, Clara and Julian lay side by side on a threadbare mattress. The soft murmur of the city's distant traffic, the occasional whisper of a passing breeze through a cracked window, and the steady rhythm of their breathing all converged into a moment of unexpected intimacy. A shared silence that spoke of resilience, hope, and the possibility of redemption in a world that often seemed determined to crush the human spirit. It was in that stillness that both began to comprehend the profound implications of their encounter with Victor Calloway, a man whose carefully calibrated tests of character had, in a single decisive moment, altered the course of their lives. For Clara, it was a revelation that even the most unassuming actions carried the weight of destiny. For Julian, it was an affirmation that beneath the harsh exterior of a world built on power and wealth, there still existed spaces where integrity and human kindness could spark a quiet revolution. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon and Veridale stirred to life once more, The lessons of the previous night became a part of the very fabric of their beings. A silent promise that no matter how many trials were forced upon them, the human heart could always find the strength to resist, to question, and to hope. In the shadow of dusk along the busy boulevard of New Avalon, Clara found herself caught in the gentle pull of fate. For a moment, she paused at the intersection of uncertainty and resolve, her heart thumping as if in tune with the rhythmic pulse of the city. A cool breeze swept along the street, urging her to make a choice that would reveal the hidden depths of her character. Instead of pretending not to notice the imposing figure waiting by the curb, she took a deep breath and strode across the pavement, coming to a halt directly before him. "You're not truly blind, are you?" she inquired, her voice a mix of challenge and curiosity. The man known as Victor Calloway, a man whose reputation for conducting enigmatic tests of character was whispered about in the elite circles of the city, responded with a slight, knowing curl of his lips. "No," he replied simply, the word hanging in the cool evening air like a secret waiting to be unearthed. Clara crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing in a mixture of defiance and apprehension. "Then why were you pretending?" she demanded, her tone laced with both suspicion and a desire for understanding. Victor tilted his head ever so slightly, his gaze intensifying as he sought an answer in her eyes. "Why do you think?" he countered, his voice soft yet filled with a hidden intensity that hinted at motives beyond mere deception. Her brow furrowed in thought. "To trick me," she suggested quietly, the words heavy with the weight of past experiences and hard-won wisdom. Victor shook his head, dismissing her suggestion with a calm air. "No, it was to test you," he explained, his fingers tightening around the ornate handle of his cane, a subtle reminder that every interaction held layers of meaning in this labyrinthine urban landscape. Clara's mind raced, trying to untangle the intricate web of intentions behind his actions. "That's essentially the same thing," she murmured, her voice a blend of incredulity and admiration. Victor's eyes glinted with a hint of approval as he studied her closely, acknowledging that she was sharper than he had ever anticipated. "I simply wanted to observe what you would do," he admitted, his tone conveying both a hint of vulnerability and a rigorous curiosity about the human spirit. Clara's eyes narrowed further, her expression shifting between skepticism and an unspoken invitation to delve deeper into his mystery. "Why?" she pressed, and Victor exhaled slowly, his grip on the cane tightening as if the question had suddenly become almost too profound to answer outright. Before he could muster a response, a sudden gust of wind swept through the street, disrupting the fragile balance between them. In that transient moment, a folded banknote, an elegant $100 bill, tumbled from the recesses of Victor's pocket, spiraling through the air and landing on the cold pavement at Clara's feet. Time seemed to slow as the bustling sounds of New Avalon, the blare of horns, the murmur of pedestrians, the distant echoes of commerce, faded into an almost surreal background. For several heartbeats, neither of them moved. The world around them blurred, leaving only the soft flutter of the paper money and the silent communication of shared intent. Finally, with a measured deliberation, Clara bent down and retrieved the bill, extending it toward Victor as if offering a final piece of the puzzle. Victor's eyes softened as he accepted the note, a quiet warmth blooming in his chest, a silent acknowledgement that, once again, she had passed an invisible yet formidable test. From half a block away, Julian, a young man whose life had been marked by the relentless struggle to survive in this unforgiving city, watched the scene with a growing sense of alarm. His instincts, honed by years of hardship, screamed that something was amiss. "Clara! With him!" The words, filled with dread and maternal protectiveness, burst from him as he broke into a run toward the pair. Victor, still absorbed in the enigmatic exchange, turned at the sound of hurried footsteps. Just then, Julian reached out, grabbing Clara's arm and yanking her away from Victor with a force born of desperation and fierce loyalty. "Get away from her!" Julian shouted, his voice echoing against the concrete walls of New Avalon's labyrinthine streets. The sudden intervention startled Clara, causing her to flinch, caught off guard by the sudden eruption of paternal instinct. "Julian, stop! What on earth are you doing?" she cried out, a mixture of shock and confusion lacing her tone. Julian's expression hardened as he stepped firmly between her and Victor. His hands, clenched tightly at his sides, radiated an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You don't speak to her like that. You don't test her," Julian declared, his words sharp as they cut through the lingering tension. His protective fervor was palpable, a testament to the relentless struggles that had forged his spirit in the crucible of poverty. Victor, unruffled by the sudden confrontation, adjusted his cuffs with an air of detached composure. "She's an exceptional young lady," he stated evenly, his voice betraying none of the internal conflict that Julian's intervention had stirred. For a fleeting moment, the two men locked eyes, the storm of Julian's protective anger clashing with the cool, calculating resolve in Victor's gaze. "She's my daughter," Julian blurted out, the words tumbling over one another in a rush of raw emotion. In that charged moment, something shifted in Victor's demeanor. His face softened, ever so slightly, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a flicker of recognition and understanding that transcended the rigid boundaries of class and circumstance. Julian, his heart still pounding and his chest tight with both fury and fear, forced himself to steady his breathing as Victor slowly tucked the $100 bill back into his pocket. "We don't need your money," Victor said quietly, his tone almost conciliatory as he gave Julian a long, searching look. Then, without further word, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a scene that was as enigmatic as it was emotionally charged. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her eyes following Victor's retreating figure, a storm of conflicting emotions swirling within her. The silence that fell over her was heavy with the unspoken question of what had just transpired. Julian, his face etched with worry and a lingering anger, exhaled shakily. "This isn't over," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the ambient hum of the city. "Not yet." Rather than hurrying Clara home, Julian led her through the quieter, more secluded streets of New Avalon, seeking refuge from the public eye and the ever-watchful gaze of those who played dangerous games with human lives. Their destination was an old, neglected basketball court, a relic from a bygone era when the city had seemed full of hope and possibility. Once a sanctuary for dreams and laughter, the court now bore the scars of time, its broken hoop a poignant reminder of youthful aspirations that had long since faded into memory. The memories of their earlier days in New Avalon, when hope had seemed tangible and the world held endless promise, echoed softly in the worn pavement and crumbling walls of the court. Clara sank onto the curb, hugging her knees as if trying to shield herself from the overwhelming cascade of emotions. Since Julian's frantic intervention, she had remained silent, the events of the encounter with Victor Calloway swirling in her mind like an unsolvable riddle. When she encountered Mr. Victor Calloway, swirling in her mind like an unsolvable riddle. "You're upset," she murmured softly, breaking the heavy silence. Julian's face, etched with exhaustion and worry, turned away as he rubbed his tired hands over his face. "I'm not mad," he began haltingly, then paused, searching for the right words. I don't trust him," he finally admitted, his voice heavy with the scars of past betrayals. Clara, always the quieter voice in their duo, countered in a hushed tone, "He isn't all bad." Yet Julian's eyes, hardened by years of dealing with the unyielding cruelty of the world, betrayed his inner turmoil. "You think you understand, but you don't," he insisted, his voice low and filled with an intensity that was almost palpable. "Rich men like Victor Calloway, they never do anything for free. Their gestures, no matter how kind they seem, always come with a hidden agenda." Clara slowly lifted her head, her eyes reflecting a mixture of defiance and sadness. "And you do understand, don't you?" she challenged, her tone soft yet resolute. For a moment, Julian looked away, the painful memories of being treated as nothing more than a disposable servant flashing across his mind. His past, marked by encounters with those who paid him only a pittance for his labor, men who barely acknowledged his existence and discarded both food and dignity in equal measure, seemed to echo in his every word. He sat down beside her, resting his forearms on his knees, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Listen to me, Clara. You can't trust people like him. They are dangerous." Her sigh was heavy with resignation, the truth of his words resonating in the quiet space between them. "You always say that," she murmured, a note of sorrow mingling with the inevitable acceptance of their harsh reality. "Because it's true," Julian replied, his tone firm yet tinged with vulnerability. After a brief pause, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "We're not supposed to be here, you know. If the wrong person finds out, if the wrong whispers reach the wrong ears." His words trailed off, leaving an unspoken threat hanging in the air. Clara's fingers tightened on her knees, her body language a silent protest against the vulnerabilities that Julian's warnings evoked. "I know," she snapped suddenly, standing up with a surge of defiant energy. "I know, okay? I'm not naive." Julian, still reeling from the intensity of the moment, hesitated before running a hand through his hair, as if trying to smooth away the remnants of frustration. "I didn't say you were," he replied softly, his voice laden with worry as he tried to bridge the chasm between protection and understanding. Clara turned away abruptly, the clack of her boot against a loose stone punctuating the silence that had fallen over them. "It's not fair," she whispered, her tone a fragile mixture of pain and determination. "I know," Julian managed to say, swallowing his pride and the bitter taste of resignation. For a long, loaded moment, neither spoke, their silence heavy with the unspoken weight of their shared struggles. Finally, with a resolve that bordered on defiance, Clara crossed her arms and asked, "So what do we do now?" Julian's deep, steady exhale was the only response before he replied, "We remain silent, we tread carefully, and we keep our distance from Victor Calloway." His words were measured and firm, a mantra born of hardship and countless lessons learned in the crucible of survival. Clara's eyes searched his face, a flicker of dissent mingling with her cautious acceptance, and that very uncertainty stirred something deep within Julian, a fear that perhaps their fragile existence was on the precipice of being irrevocably altered. In the distance, a dark car idled quietly, its tinted windows concealing the intentions of its occupant. Inside, Victor Calloway sat with his back to the world, staring blankly out at the cityscape as if trying to decipher its myriad secrets. His loyal assistant, Elliot, sat across from him, tapping quietly at a tablet, the tension in the air palpable. In the dim interior of his car, Victor's voice was measured and almost impersonal as he addressed Elliot. "Find everything you can on Julian and Clara Reyes." Elliot frowned, clearly apprehensive about delving into the private lives of the young pair, but before he could protest further, Victor's tone brooked no argument. "It's not personal, just a necessary precaution," he said, his gaze still fixed on the passing scenery. The conversation between them, while clipped and businesslike, carried an undercurrent of something far more personal. An obsession with the intricate interplay of fate, trust, and the tenuous bonds that held this disparate cast of characters together. After a few moments, Elliot reluctantly complied, his fingers dancing over the keys as he set about gathering every scrap of data. Meanwhile, Victor leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes briefly as Julian's earlier impassioned words, "She's my kid," echoed in his mind. There was something in that declaration that gnawed at him, a challenge to the carefully constructed edifice of his own intentions. He needed to understand why the bond between Julian and Clara elicited such a reaction in him. The soft hum of the engine, the distant murmur of city life, and the rapid beat of his own heart all coalesced into a moment of introspection that was as unsettling as it was inevitable. Later that evening, as the neon glow of New Avalon's streetlights bathed the city in a surreal luminescence, Julian returned to the modest sanctuary of the diner where he worked. The shift had been grueling, a 12-hour marathon marked by endless calculations of hours and tips that never seemed to add up. The diner, a relic of better times now overrun by hardship, was nearly empty as chairs were stacked on tables and the bitter aroma of burnt coffee lingered like a stubborn memory. Julian's heart ached with the knowledge that rent was due in mere days. And yet every calculation seemed to deepen the chasm between his aspirations and the harsh realities of survival. Inside the cramped kitchen, Julian could count the exhaustion in every gesture. A symphony of sighs, whispered pleas, and the steady rhythm of survival. His manager, Mr. Chet Ramsey, a man who regarded time and money with the same indifferent precision as one might a ledger, barely glanced up as Julian knocked on his office door. "I need more hours," Julian stated, his voice steady despite the tumult raging inside him. Mr. Chet Ramsey's response was as cold as the metal of the door hinge. "I already told you, kid, we're covered." Yet Julian's desperate plea, bolstered by the knowledge of his unyielding work ethic, only met with a curt dismissal. After a tense exchange that left Julian with nothing more than the bitter taste of unfulfilled promises, he stepped out into the night. Outside, Clara awaited him, her presence a comforting counterpoint to the drudgery of his day. As they walked side by side under the indifferent gaze of the city's towering spires, a shadow fell over them. An all-too-familiar reminder that their lives were perpetually intertwined with forces beyond their control. At that moment, Victor Calloway reappeared like a ghost from the past. His presence, as inscrutable as ever, set Julian's heart pounding with dread. "Clara," he said, his voice low, causing her to hesitate. "I didn't speak with him," she managed, her voice wavering between confusion and defiance as she watched Victor's unyielding eyes follow their every move. Julian's hands clenched at his sides, his protective instincts flaring into a silent vow. Enough was enough. Fueled by a surge of raw emotion, Julian stormed into the imposing office building where Victor had taken refuge. Without a word of apology, he barged past the indifferent assistant Elliot and confronted Victor directly. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Julian's palms slammed onto the polished desk, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Stay away from my sister," he declared, each word a testament to the fierce love that bound him to Clara. Victor, unfazed by the outburst, regarded Julian with a detached calmness. "I'm afraid I can't do that," he replied, his voice cool and measured, as if the declaration was not a personal affront but merely a variable in an equation he had long since learned to balance. Julian's jaw tightened as he retorted, "You don't get to decide that." The ensuing silence was heavy with unspoken truths and the bitterness of past wounds. In the dimming light of a late afternoon in Evershade, a city where the glimmer of wealth intertwined with the grit of survival, Julian's mind was a turbulent mix of anger, confusion, and weary resignation. His recent encounter in the austere office of the enigmatic Victor Calloway still reverberated in his ears, a cacophony of conflicting emotions that refused to subside. Victor, with his calm authority and inscrutable gaze, had dismissed Julian's fervent declarations with nothing more than a few measured words. Yet beneath that calm exterior, Victor's mind churned with thoughts of control and calculated power. "You'll never understand," Julian muttered bitterly as he shook his head and stepped back, his voice heavy with the weight of experiences too painful to share. His words floated in the charged air, a final declaration of defiance before he turned and walked away from the imposing presence of Calloway. The office door closed softly behind him, leaving Victor standing alone, a frown of barely concealed displeasure crossing his features. In his world, where people listened to his every command and obeyed his every order, Julian's rejection was not something he could easily ignore. Victor had built his vast empire on the principles of power, control, and a strict adherence to his own rules. His carefully constructed world was one where every gesture carried hidden significance and every transaction was a test of loyalty or worth. Yet now, Julian Reyes, an ordinary man fighting desperately to keep his family afloat, had walked out of his office as if Victor's words and presence were nothing more than a trivial inconvenience. That act of defiant independence did not sit well with Calloway, whose self-assurance was deeply tied to the unchallenged obedience of those around him. Elliot, Victor's ever-observant assistant, leaned casually against the doorframe, his eyes tracking the silent drama unfolding before him. "You let him go," Elliot remarked softly, noting with a hint of exasperation that despite all of Victor's efforts, Julian had slipped away. Victor, who had been staring out at the sprawling city from his office window, did not turn around as Elliot continued. "He would have left no matter what I said." Elliot's arms crossed as he continued. "And yet, you're not done, are you?" The tension in Victor's jaw tightened imperceptibly as he considered Elliot's words. "No," came Elliot's resigned admission after a brief pause. "I get it. You're curious. But this isn't a business deal, Victor. This is a kid trying to survive." The words hung in the air like an indictment of the cold logic that governed Victor's life. Victor turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "You think I don't know that?" he asked, his tone quiet but edged with a challenge. Elliot raised his hands in surrender, cautioning, "I think you're forgetting that not everything is a problem that can be solved with money or power." For a moment, Victor was silent, his inner convictions battling Elliot's pragmatic concerns. But then, with a steely glint in his eyes, he dismissed the thought. Because I believe everything has a solution, he declared firmly, as if the simple act of stating it could erase the complexities of life. Meanwhile, on the quiet streets of Evershade, the air between Julian and his sister Clara grew heavy with unspoken worries. Their walk home was cloaked in silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic sound of their footsteps on cracked sidewalks. Julian's shoulders were tense, and his hands remained buried deep in the pockets of his worn jacket, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. Clara, whose gaze wandered as if searching for answers to unasked questions, longed to know what had been said by Victor to spark Julian's seething anger. But deep within, she already sensed Julian's silent command, a familiar refrain echoing through their lives since childhood: stay away from him. For as long as she could remember, Clara had spent her life evading the prying eyes of those who would demand too many answers. She had dodged questions from nosy neighbors, evaded the watchful stares of the police, and lived in constant flight from any hint of inquiry that might reveal the scars of their past. Yet tonight, even that habitual caution could not shield her from the weight of a new and foreboding chapter in their turbulent lives. Their quiet journey was abruptly shattered by an unexpected knock at the door of their dilapidated apartment. The knock came late at night, echoing ominously in the silence that had enveloped their meager home. Julian's heart leapt into his throat. No one ever knocked on their door. With adrenaline surging through his veins, he grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside his threadbare mattress and crept carefully toward the door, pressing his ear against its cold surface. A hesitant voice then broke through the stillness. "Julian, Julian." The voice was unmistakable, urgent and familiar, yet filled with a disconcerting calm. "Victor?" Julian's stomach dropped as he muttered under his breath, disbelief and anxiety mingling in his tone. Glancing toward the room where Clara lay sleeping, he knew that whatever awaited outside could not be ignored. Slowly, with every sense on high alert, he unlocked the door and swung it open. There, standing in the dimly lit hallway of their aging apartment building, was Victor Calloway. He appeared composed, as if he belonged in this shadowy space despite his immaculate appearance. Julian stepped outside and shut the door behind him, his voice low and wary as he demanded, "You don't get to show up here." Victor, unfazed, slipped his hands into the pockets of his tailored coat. "I had a feeling you wouldn't answer my calls," he said smoothly. Julian's lips curled into a bitter laugh, disbelief mingling with indignation. "You have my number?" he challenged. Victor raised an eyebrow with a subtle, almost amused smile. "It wouldn't be hard to find, even if I hadn't," he replied coolly. Julian's teeth clenched, his grip on the bat tightening as he prepared for whatever confrontation might come next. "Leave!" Julian shouted, his voice rising with desperation and defiance, yet Victor did not move. Instead, he fixed Julian with a piercing stare. "You're running out of time," he said in a measured tone that was both a warning and an eerie promise. Julian stiffened, his pulse quickening as Victor continued. "Your rent, your job, your entire situation is on the brink. You're running out of time." The words reverberated through Julian's core, leaving him momentarily stunned as the reality of his precarious existence pressed down on him. A heavy silence fell between them, charged with tension and unspoken understanding. Then, in a voice that was as simple as it was unsettling, Victor offered, "I can help." At those words, Julian's grip on the bat tightened even further. In a moment that defied expectations, a hollow, bitter laugh escaped Julian, a laugh devoid of joy, filled instead with the dark weariness of a man who had fought for every scrap of survival. "You think money fixes everything, Julian," Victor murmured, his tone laced with a mixture of derision and pity. "You think you can just show up, wave your hand, and make everything better." Julian shook his head, his voice quivering as he spat out, "You don't know what it's like to fight for every single day, to wake up every morning knowing that one mistake could mean the loss of everything." His jaw clenched as the raw truth of his words filled the cold night air. "You don't understand," he continued, his tone edged with both pain and anger. For a long moment, Victor remained silent, his eyes never leaving Julian's. Then, in a voice softer than before, Victor admitted, "You're right." The unexpected admission caused Julian to blink in surprise, a crack in the armor of the man who had always been so resolute. Victor's gaze, however, remained steady as he added, "I may not understand everything, but I want to. I want to understand." Julian swallowed hard, the raw vulnerability in Victor's words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Why?" Julian demanded, his voice raw with emotion. For the first time since their confrontation began, Victor's perfectly controlled facade wavered, and he hesitated before answering, "Because someone once told me the same thing." Julian frowned, confused and skeptical. "What do you mean?" Victor looked down at the floor for a moment before meeting Julian's eyes again. "A long time ago, someone told me that I'd never truly grasp what it meant to have nothing, to know the despair of having no one to rely on, no safety net to catch you when you fell." His voice grew softer, almost wistful, and they were right. "I didn't understand it back then, but now, I do." Julian stared at Victor, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the two very different men before him. He had expected arrogance, perhaps a dismissive sneer, but instead he found a trace of sincerity in Victor's admission, a vulnerability that he hadn't anticipated. Yet even as a flicker of understanding passed between them, Julian's instincts screamed that this was not a moment for reconciliation, but a crossroads from which there was no easy return. Before either of them could speak further, a sharp sound shattered the fragile dialogue, a piercing scream emanating from across the street. Julian's heart lurched as he recognized the voice immediately. "Clara!" he cried out, dread twisting his insides. In an instant, the world around him collapsed into chaos. Clara, who had been on her way to the nearby bodega just a few blocks away, now lay crumpled on the pavement. Her body, usually so full of life despite its hardships, had crumpled as if the very weight of the world had finally overwhelmed her. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as people gathered, their voices a confused cacophony of concern and shock. Yelling, footsteps echoing, and then fingers reaching out. Darkness closed in around her. Julian did not remember running until he found himself collapsing beside her, his hands trembling as he desperately tried to lift her from the cold, unforgiving ground. "Clara!" His voice cracked in terror, but she offered no answer. Before Julian could gather his wits, Victor knelt beside him, his own expression etched with urgency. "She needs a hospital," Victor stated plainly, his tone devoid of the usual arrogance. Julian's vision blurred, and for a moment the only thing he could feel was the burning heat of Clara's skin against his shaking hands. She was too hot, too pale, and disturbingly still. Victor's voice broke through the haze, repeating, "She needs a hospital." Julian's mind raced with fear and hesitation. Hospital visits meant questions, and for someone like Clara it meant exposing the vulnerabilities that had kept her hidden from a world that would never understand. It meant papers, risk, and the terrifying possibility of losing her forever. But as Victor's insistent gaze met his, Julian knew that he had no choice. With trembling fingers, Julian did the one thing he had long avoided, the act of accepting help when his pride and fear told him to run. "I have a car," Victor offered, his voice gentle yet insistent, cutting through the swirling chaos of Julian's thoughts. For a long, agonizing moment, Julian hesitated, caught in the crossroads between his desperate need to protect Clara and his deeply ingrained distrust of those who promised salvation too easily. Then, with a heavy heart and an urgency that belied his fear, he whispered, "I'll take her." Victor's eyes remained locked on Julian's as the two men shared a silent understanding, a tacit acknowledgement of the perilous dance they were now engaged in. The promise of help was a double-edged sword, one that could lift them from the depths of despair or drag them further into a web of obligations from which there was no easy escape. As the night deepened, the echoes of the evening's events reverberated through every fiber of Julian's being. He barely slept that night. Victor Calloway's sudden appearance at their door was not merely unsettling, it was a clear, ominous warning. A warning that spoke of a system where help came at a price, where every kind gesture was a transaction, and where even a single acceptance could bind you in chains that were impossible to break. When dawn finally broke over Evershade, Julian slipped away from the apartment before Clara awoke, his mind already churning with plans and desperate alternatives. Rent was overdue, and the diner where he worked had long since ceased offering extra shifts. Every trusted friend had been asked for a loan, every avenue exhausted, and now his options were dwindling with each passing hour. In a small, cramped room above a dilapidated storefront, Julian sat with his head in his hands, wrestling with the grim realization that a single bad choice might be the only way out. Across town, in his sterile, minimalist office, Victor Calloway leafed through the sparse file that Elliot had compiled on Julian and Clara. The file was thin, no social security numbers, no credit history, and only a handful of records dating back 5 years. It confirmed what Victor had long suspected. They were undocumented, adrift in a world that would offer them no mercy, and that fact changed everything. Elliot, still leaning against the doorframe, asked in a low voice, "What's the plan?" Victor tapped the folder thoughtfully. "They're running out of time," he said, almost to himself. Elliot sighed, the weight of the situation evident in his tone. "And what? You're going to save them?" Victor's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, the real question lingering in the space between them being not whether he could, but whether he should intervene in the lives of those who had so little to lose. Meanwhile, Julian found himself standing outside a small corner store on 7th Avenue, staring through the glass at the register. The mundane scene was a stark contrast to the storm raging in his heart. It would have been so easy, too easy, to slip inside, grab a couple $100s and use that money to pay rent, to buy a few more days of safety for Clara. But the thought made his fists clench in disgust at the very idea of stooping to a level he had always fought against. Yet the need was desperate, the pressure suffocating, and the temptation was real. As Julian lingered on the precipice of a decision that could change everything, a low, even, calm voice stopped him in his tracks. "Don't." The word was barely audible, but it carried the full weight of his own inner turmoil. Startled, he turned sharply, and there, standing before him as if summoned by fate, was Victor Calloway once again. "What the hell are you doing here?" Julian demanded, his pulse spiking as his eyes locked onto Victor's unflinching gaze. Victor took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I'm here to stop you," he said plainly. "You don't know what you're about to do." Julian scoffed bitterly, his voice trembling with a mix of defiance and exhaustion. "Yes, I do," Victor replied with unwavering conviction. "I know exactly what you're about to do, and I know you don't need my help." Julian's jaw clenched as he retorted, "Then why are you standing here, outside a convenience store at 7 in the morning, trying to talk me out of making a mistake?" The words were laced with both anger and despair. Victor studied him intently, then offered a proposal that seemed too good to be true. "Come with me," he said softly. "I have a job for you." For a long, suspended moment, Julian's mind raced as he considered the possibility. Victor explained that he owned several properties, one of which desperately needed a live-in maintenance man, a position that would come with free rent and a steady income. It was a lifeline, a real way out of the endless cycle of poverty and uncertainty. But the offer, no matter how promising, filled Julian with a bitter sense of indignation. "Do you think I want a handout?" he snapped, his voice rough with both anger and hurt. Victor's response was measured and calm. "It's not a handout, it's a job," he insisted. Julian shook his head in disbelief. "Why do you even care?" he demanded, his eyes searching Victor's face for any sign of ulterior motive. Victor exhaled slowly, his expression softening. "Because someone once helped me when I was in your shoes," he admitted quietly, and for a moment, Julian's hardened exterior faltered. "Aye." Before either man could delve deeper into the implications of that admission, a piercing scream shattered the fragile calm. From across the street, a sound filled with terror and pain, Clara's voice. In an instant, Julian's heart froze. He had known that voice since childhood, and now it carried the unmistakable ring of distress. Without thinking, he bolted, racing back toward the sound of her anguish. Moments later, Julian found himself crumpled on the pavement beside a motionless Clara. The world around them had become a blur of startled faces, hurried footsteps, and panicked voices. He could barely register what was happening as he frantically tried to lift her, his trembling hands barely able to comprehend the shock of her burning, pale skin. "Clara?" he cried, his voice cracking in terror and disbelief. She remained silent, her eyes closed, her body unnervingly still. Victor, ever the pragmatist, knelt beside Julian. "She needs a hospital," he repeated urgently, his tone leaving no room for argument. Julian's mind raced with conflicting emotions. If he took her to a hospital, questions would be asked, and papers might be required, exposing them in ways he had fought so hard to avoid. But if he did nothing, Clara's life would hang in the balance. With a heavy heart and a trembling resolve, Julian did the one thing he had spent years avoiding. "I'll take her," he whispered, conceding to the grim necessity of the moment. The decision, as it was made in a rush of panic and love, carried with it the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. As they hurried toward Victor's car, Julian's thoughts churned with the implications of what had just transpired. Victor's sudden appearances, his offers of help, each was a double-edged sword that promised salvation while threatening to ensnare them in a web of obligations and peril. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to dispel the night's shadows over Evershade, Julian's mind was a maelstrom of worry and determination. The events of the night had left scars deeper than any physical injury, and the specter of Victor Calloway's presence loomed large over every decision he was about to make. With Clara's fragile condition weighing on his conscience, Julian knew that the choices ahead would not only define his own destiny, but could very well alter the course of their entire lives. Every moment now was a battle against time, a desperate race to secure the few remaining threads of hope in a world that had so long been indifferent to their struggles. And even as Victor Calloway's inscrutable gaze lingered in the recesses of his memory, Julian vowed silently that he would do whatever it took to keep his sister safe, even if that meant stepping into a realm of uncertainty from which there might be no return. In the midst of the chaos and blurred neon reflections of night on the rain-slicked streets of Westvale, a city where fortunes and misfortunes collided in equal measure, Julian's world had been shattered and reassembled in fragments. The car ride that followed Victor Calloway's unexpected arrival was a tumultuous, surreal blur of emotions and shifting realities. Julian found himself pressed into the back seat of the sleek black sedan, cradling his sister Clara tightly against his chest. Her shallow, uneven breaths were the only measure of life he could hold on to, and every jolt from the uneven road sent fresh waves of dread crashing through him. Victor's hands, white-knuckled on the steering wheel, navigated the traffic with a relentless urgency, as though he were racing not only against time, but also against fate itself. Julian cared little about the path they took. As long as they reached the hospital in time, all else could be forgotten. The sedan burst through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room at a frantic pace. In that moment, the cold sterility of the hospital collided with the desperate heat of life. Victor strode ahead with the authority of a man used to commanding attention, his voice cutting through the chaos. "She's burning up," Julian gasped as he struggled with the weight of his own concern and the physical strain of carrying Clara. Her condition was dire. She had collapsed suddenly, and a nurse rushed forward to check her vital signs. "How long she'd been like this?" the nurse asked, her tone sharp with both worry and the routine judgment honed by years of witnessing human fragility. Julian's throat tightened as he tried to answer, but no words came. The nurse's expression grew sterner as she demanded, "Sir, we need identification." The very words made Julian's stomach churn with foreboding. He knew this moment was inevitable. Before Julian could offer any explanation, Victor stepped forward smoothly, as if the next move in this intricate game of survival had already been rehearsed. "Put the bill under my name," Victor said, producing his own identification with a calm that belied the urgency of the situation. His look was the kind that left no room for debate, and after a moment of tense silence, the nurse acquiesced with a curt nod. "All right," she said, though her tone held an undercurrent of disapproval. "But we'll still need the girl's information." Julian's hands clenched into fists as his internal alarm blared. He knew too well the labyrinthine traps that lay within hospital bureaucracy. Victor, with a dismissive tilt of his head, murmured in a low, controlled voice, "I can handle this. Go with her." Julian hesitated, torn between the instinct to follow his protective sister and his own mounting suspicion. However, as the doctors wheeled Clara away, her fragile form disappearing into the sterile depths of the hospital corridors, nothing else mattered to him in that instant. In the antiseptic waiting room, time dragged on like an interminable sentence. Julian paced, each step echoing his inner turmoil. His mind churned with 1,000 questions that clashed with his desire to simply protect Clara. Hours passed in that oppressive silence, until finally a doctor emerged, face inscrutable as ever. Julian nearly broke into a run, desperation lacing every word as he pleaded, "How is she?" The doctor's response was measured yet grave. "She's stable, but she's suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition, and her fever could have become dangerous if we'd waited any longer." Julian's heart sank further with each word, his throat tightening as the weight of their precarious existence pressed down on him. The doctor's next words sent a fresh shock through Julian. "But we need to talk about something else." Confusion mingled with rising terror in Julian's mind. "What?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Legally, we have to report cases like this," the doctor continued, explaining that social services would need to intervene to ensure Clara was in a safe environment. Julian's body stiffened, as if struck by an invisible blow. "We're fine," he insisted quickly, his voice desperate. "I'd take care of her." The doctor's eyes, however, held skepticism. It was then Julian realized that the scrutiny wasn't solely directed at Clara's health. It was aimed squarely at him, the one who had always fought to shield his sister from the harshness of a callous world. Before Julian could fully process the implications, he stormed out of the treatment room into the sterile corridor, his anger and fear colliding. There, waiting outside the hospital room like a sentinel, stood Victor Calloway. Julian's chest heaved with fury and helplessness as he confronted him. "We need to go. Now." Victor's calm response, a slight raise of his eyebrow, was almost too composed. "She just got out of danger?" The tension between them thickened as Julian's fists tightened in silent protest. A staccato phone call later, Victor's voice cut through the mounting tension with chilling precision. "They've called social services." Julian's blood ran cold at the revelation. "You knew?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of betrayal and fear. Victor exhaled slowly, his face a mask of controlled resignation. "It was always a possibility," he said softly. The words reverberated in Julian's mind as he grappled with the painful reality. He could not lose her. I can't lose her," he muttered, voice raw with emotion. After a long moment of tense silence, Victor made a decision without the customary tests of his character. "I'll handle it," he declared decisively, producing his phone and dialing with deliberate care. Julian frowned, uncertainty mingling with the ever-deepening distrust he felt toward the powerful man who had intruded into every aspect of their lives. "What?" Julian asked, his voice thick with apprehension. Victor's response was firm yet gentle. "Just trust me." Julian's eyes flickered with a reluctant resignation. He did not trust Victor Calloway, yet in that desperate moment, he had little choice. Throughout his entire life, Julian had prided himself on avoiding the clutches of rich, influential men who wielded their power like a weapon and could change lives with a single phone call. Now, as Victor spoke in a smooth, controlled tone that sent shivers down his spine, Julian realized he was trapped in a web of debt he had never imagined. "Listen," Victor said, pacing near the waiting room window. "I need this handled. The girl stays with her brother, no paperwork, no investigations." His voice was low, deliberate, and carried an almost imperceptible threat. Julian's fists clenched, the implications of that directive sinking in. This was exactly what he had fought against his entire life. A rich man pulling strings, dictating outcomes, and deciding the fate of those like him. When the call ended, Victor slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned to Julian with a simple, unsettling pronouncement. "It's done." Julian's jaw tightened in disbelief. "What does that mean?" he demanded, voice barely containing the surge of mixed emotions. "It means social services will look the other way," Victor explained coolly. Julian exhaled sharply, a wave of relief that was quickly tainted by the bitter taste of defeat. He realized that this was not his victory, but Victor's. A victory that now bound him in a debt he never wished to incur. As the night wore on, Clara's voice gently broke through Julian's heavy thoughts. "Julian," she whispered softly from the doorway of her hospital room. Rushing to her side, Julian found her small, tired, yet awake and managing a weak smile. "I'm okay," she murmured, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her pain. Julian cupped her face tenderly, his own heart chattering at the sight. "You scared me," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. For a fleeting moment, his gaze drifted to where Victor stood, and a storm of conflicting feelings roiled within him. Clara hesitated, then in a small, barely audible tone, she asked, "He helped us, didn't he?" Julian's heart sank as he fought to suppress the myriad of emotions surging within him. He wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her that he had fixed everything, but the truth was more complicated than that. They left the hospital quietly that night, Victor having arranged everything so impeccably that no bill, no questions disrupted their escape. Outside the hospital, as they stepped into the chill of the early morning, Victor's voice resonated with unyielding authority. "Your place isn't safe. Come with me." Julian's body tensed and he bristled with defiance. "We're not going anywhere with you," he snapped, though deep inside he knew he had few options left. Victor's eyes remained steady as he stated plainly, "You don't have many options left." Julian swallowed hard, knowing all too well that following Victor's lead meant owing him even more, an obligation that cut into the very core of his pride. Clara tugged gently at Julian's sleeve, her eyes pleading for reassurance. "Julian," she said softly, and in that moment he recognized the unspoken plea that had haunted him for years. "Trust him, just for a little while." It was a heart-wrenching moment of vulnerability. After years of shielding her from the machinations of men like Victor, she was now asking him to take a leap of faith. With a heavy heart and trembling resolve, Julian closed his eyes and finally nodded. Victor, without a trace of a smug "I told you so," simply turned and led the way. And so, with no clear path ahead and no certainty that this was the right choice, Julian followed. The ride in Victor's car was an eerie silence, punctuated only by the muted hum of the engine. In the back seat, Clara remained curled against the door, her exhaustion etched into every line of her face, while Julian sat beside her, his body rigid with apprehension. Every bump in the road, every flicker of the streetlights outside, reminded him of the precariousness of their existence. Slowly, the familiar grimy landscape of their old neighborhood gave way to a cleaner, quieter part of town. One where the sidewalks bore fewer cracks and no one slept on the benches. The contrast was jarring, and it made Julian's stomach twist in discomfort. He knew deep down that they did not belong in this polished, unfeeling part of the city. At last they arrived at a towering apartment building that seemed worlds away from everything Julian had ever known. The edifice, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and impeccably furnished lobby, radiated a cold, unyielding affluence. Victor's apartment occupied an entire floor, a private sanctuary of wealth and order that Julian could scarcely imagine existing in his world. Inside, Clara sat hesitantly on the edge of a plush leather couch while Julian lingered in the background, his eyes never straying from the oppressive luxury that surrounded them. Victor made his way to the kitchen without so much as a glance in Julian's direction. "Do you need food?" he asked matter-of-factly, his tone devoid of any personal warmth. Julian's jaw tightened in silent protest. "We're fine," he replied, his voice brittle with suppressed anger. Ignoring Julian's protest, Victor retrieved 2 plates from the immaculate refrigerator and set them on the counter. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of steaming pasta, an unexpected meal in a place so alien to her everyday hunger. "Is that pasta?" she asked hesitantly, to which Victor simply replied, "Go ahead." Reluctantly, Clara stood and approached the table, each step heavy with the awareness that she was partaking in a luxury far removed from her usual hardships. Julian's stomach clenched as he watched her, a painful mix of jealousy and worry surging through him. He resented the ease with which Victor managed every detail of their predicament, the ready food, the warm shelter, the effortless manner in which problems were solved with a few phone calls. He forced himself to meet Victor's steady gaze, his voice low and bitter. "How long do we stay?" Victor leaned against the counter, his tone calm yet unyielding. "As long as you need," Julian scoffed, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "That's not how the world works," he muttered. Victor's reply was terse and final. "It is when I say so." As the conversation unfolded in stilted exchanges, Victor's proposal became unmistakable. "We don't take charity," he explained softly. "It's not charity, it's a trade." Julian's eyes narrowed and he demanded, "What trade?" Victor sipped his drink before responding with measured clarity. "Work for me. Keep this place running. The apartment, the buildings I own. Fix things. Earn your stay." The words echoed in the quiet room, and Julian's heart pounded with a mix of fear and reluctant hope. This was more than anyone had ever offered him. A real job, a lifeline, and yet it terrified him, for nothing in life was ever truly free, and Julian knew all too well that every opportunity carried a hidden price. Victor watched Julian carefully, his gaze unblinking as he stated, "I don't expect an answer tonight." Julian exhaled slowly, torn between his instinct to say no and the desperate need for any semblance of stability. In the silence that followed, he knew that the decision he faced was the culmination of years spent protecting Clara from the harsh realities of a world ruled by powerful men, like Victor Calloway. At last, the conversation ended as the night deepened. Victor did not push further, and Julian was left alone with his turbulent thoughts. The hours stretched on as he wrestled with the bitter truth. Accepting help from a man who had never known struggle would mean indebting himself in ways he could not imagine. Yet, as he looked at Clara, her tired eyes filled with hope despite the odds, he understood that sometimes survival demanded compromises no one wished to make. Guilt and resignation warred within him as he finally said nothing. Instead, he simply nodded, and Victor led the way out of the luxurious apartment into the cool night. The drive back was quiet and heavy with unspoken promises and fears, each moment a reminder that nothing in their world came without consequence. At long last, Victor's car pulled up to a modest building that Julian recognized all too well, the only place he had ever called home. In that familiar, worn-down setting, Julian felt the crushing weight of indebtedness settle on his shoulders. His heart ached with the realization that while he might keep Clara safe for now, every choice he made was binding him further to a fate he had long fought against. In the silent hours before dawn, as Julian lay awake listening to the creaks of the old building and the distant hum of the city, he wondered what the future held. Each decision had led him further from the life he had known, deeper into a maze of obligations and uncertain alliances. And yet, even as the dread of indebtedness gnawed at him, he found a sliver of resolve in the promise he had made to his sister. A promise to protect her, no matter the cost. In the quiet aftermath of that fateful day, as the city of Westvale surrendered to the cool embrace of midnight, Julian found himself ensnared in a relentless cycle of choices he had never wished to face. There was no alternative left, no escape from the burden that now tethered him to Victor Calloway. Later that night, when Clara lay asleep in one of the guest rooms arranged by Victor, Julian remained awake, sitting by a narrow window in a sparsely decorated corridor of the upscale apartment. Outside, the city lights shimmered like distant promises, but inside, the weight of his decisions pressed upon him like unyielding chains. Across from him, in a chair that faced the window, Victor poured himself a glass of whiskey with deliberate care. The amber liquid glistened in the low light, and with each measured sip he seemed to invite Julian into a conversation that had long been overdue. "Ask me what you want to ask," Victor finally said, his tone both challenging and open, as if daring Julian to unburden the secret turmoil that lay within. Julian stared into the darkened room, his voice caught somewhere between anger and sorrow. "Why are you doing this?" he managed to say after a long silence, the question heavy with years of mistrust and regret. Victor's eyes softened for a moment as he sipped his drink. "Because someone once did it for me," he replied, his voice echoing with memories of a past that was both harsh and transformative. Julian scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Bullshit," he muttered, shaking his head, as if to dispel the notion that fate could ever be so kind. Victor merely smirked, his gaze drifting over the luxurious surroundings of his apartment, a place that stood in stark contrast to the rundown quarters Julian had once known. "You think I was born like this?" Victor gestured broadly to indicate the opulent decor, the polished surfaces, and the meticulously arranged furniture. "I wasn't. I grew up in the system, foster homes, shelters, the kind of places that turn kids into ghosts, forgotten by a world that doesn't care." Julian's eyes widened with a mixture of shock and reluctant understanding. He had never imagined that Victor, the man who now wielded his power with such ease, had once known the despair of abandonment. Victor continued, swirling the whiskey in his glass as if the liquid could wash away the pain of his early years. "One person changed everything for me. A mentor who pulled me out of the darkness and gave me a job, taught me how to make something of myself. And that's what I'm offering you." For a fleeting second, Julian allowed himself to believe in the possibility of redemption, that perhaps in this twisted exchange there was a genuine chance to secure a future for Clara. But the hope was short-lived. He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to owe you anything," he said, each word laced with defiance. Victor's smirk widened imperceptibly as he replied, "You already do." The admission stung Julian deeply, his chest tightening as the reality of his indebtedness sank in. Victor leaned forward, his tone dropping to a confessional murmur that cut through the silence. "Let me tell you the truth, Reyes," he said, using Julian's surname as if to underline the gravity of the moment. "You're not walking out of Westvale without help, not without losing something along the way. I just gave you a way to keep your sister safe." Julian looked away, his face hardening as the truth resonated painfully within him. He hated that Victor was right. In that moment, the deal was sealed. Julian would work for him, and in exchange, Victor would ensure that Clara remained out of harm's way. But Julian knew all too well that this arrangement was not a simple job. It was a debt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had imagined that it might feel like a small victory, a steady roof over their heads, a reliable income that would allow him to protect his sister without resorting to desperate measures like theft or endless running. Instead, it felt like a set of unbreakable chains, slowly tightening with each passing day. The first few weeks under Victor's arrangement passed in a disorienting blur. Julian found himself laboring under the watchful eyes of Victor's property managers, fixing pipes, repairing broken windows, repainting empty apartments in buildings that Victor owned. The work was grueling, and though it was honest, every task reminded Julian of the price he was paying for this opportunity. Victor rarely hovered, yet his presence was never far away. Julian could sense him in the background, a constant reminder of the power that now held sway over his life. During this time, a subtle transformation began to take place around them. Clara, resilient despite everything, adjusted with a determination that belied her young age. She returned to school, began eating full, proper meals, and even started to laugh again, moments of joy that seemed so foreign in the harsh world they once knew. Yet, even as she embraced these small victories, Julian felt the invisible weight of his obligations pressing down upon him. He resented the ease with which Victor made life change, and he resented the dependency that was slowly eroding his pride. One cool evening, as twilight seeped into the sky and cast long shadows over the modest balcony of their temporary refuge, Clara sat beside Julian. With a gentle tone, she whispered, "This is good, right?" Her eyes were hopeful, reflecting a brightness that Julian longed to preserve. For a long moment he hesitated, torn between the desire to grant her the comfort of normalcy and the crushing awareness that their newfound stability was built on precarious ground. Finally, with a soft, resigned voice, he answered, "Yeah, Clara, it's good." Yet, even as he spoke, he knew that deep down, nothing about their situation felt truly right. Victor, ever the puppeteer, was not a man who let simplicity persist for long. One night he called Julian into his private office, a space lined with polished wood and papers that chronicled his empire. Julian entered with arms folded, his eyes filled with guarded skepticism. "What now?" he demanded, his tone edged with irritation. Victor, without looking up from his paperwork, responded coolly, "You're making progress." Julian scoffed. "I'm fixing pipes, not changing the world," he retorted, his voice a mix of frustration and bitter irony. Victor finally lifted his gaze, meeting Julian's eyes with an intensity that belied his calm demeanor. "You're building something, Julian," he said quietly. For a moment, the words hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Julian frowned, uncertain whether to accept the compliment or to dismiss it as empty flattery. Setting down his pen with deliberate care, Victor continued, "You want to know why I keep helping you?" Julian impatiently interjected, "No," but Victor smirked and leaned back in his chair. "Too bad." He paused, his expression shifting as he revealed a slice of his own past. "You remind me of myself, of a time when I didn't trust anyone, and thought the only way out was to fight for every inch. You think I'm waiting to use you, to control you? I don't need to do that. You'll do it yourself." Julian narrowed his eyes, unable to fully grasp the layered meaning behind Victor's words. "What the hell does that mean?" he finally asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and wounded pride. Victor exhaled slowly, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "You're already proving yourself, Julian. You just don't see it yet." But the conversation was abruptly cut short when the past, long suppressed, caught up with him in a devastating blow. One evening, a knock at the door shattered the fragile calm of Julian's old apartment, the very place he had fought so hard to leave behind. It wasn't Victor's luxurious abode this time, but his own former shelter, a crumbling relic of a life he once knew. Opening the door, Julian found an official letter, stamped with the unmistakable mark of ice. His hands trembled as he read the harsh words. The deportation order had been processed. Panic surged through him like icy water, and he dashed to Victor's office, the letter clutched tightly in his grasp. Victor looked up from his meticulously organized papers as Julian slammed the letter onto the desk, his voice shaking with desperation. "They're taking me! They found me!" Julian cried out, the words echoing with the weight of a lifetime spent evading the authorities. Victor's expression remained impassive as he picked up the document and scanned its contents. After a long, heavy pause, he finally said, "I can stop this." Julian's breath caught in his throat. "How?" he demanded, fear and disbelief mingling in his eyes. Victor's fingers drummed lightly on the paper as he considered his next words. "The question is, do you want me to?" he asked, his tone even and measured. Julian's eyes widened in horror as he realized the implications. "What kind of question is that?" he spat, his heart pounding in his ears. Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I can bury this entire mess, but it comes with a price." Julian felt his stomach churn in dread. "I already owe you everything," Victor continued, his gaze unflinching. "So what's one more thing?" Julian's pulse raced as he realized that the moment of decision had arrived, a moment where survival demanded that he let Victor own the rest of his life. In the end, the choice was not truly his. Despite Victor's rapid maneuvers and intricate plans, the forces he contended with were faster and more relentless. Within 2 days, ice moved in, and Julian was arrested. The world as he knew it unraveled in a series of swift, brutal events. Clara, left alone in the stark, cold reality of their separation, sat on the edge of a bed in a sparse room. Clutched tightly in her hand was a letter, written in Julian's messy, hurried handwriting. The words, scrawled with desperate hope, read, "I'm okay, Clara. I don't know when I can come back, but I will find a way. Stay strong, stay safe. Don't let them change you." Tears blurred the ink on the paper, but Clara blinked them away resolutely. She had already cried enough that night. In the doorway, Victor stood silently, watching her with a mixture of pity and resignation. He knew she was waiting for him to offer words of consolation, to fill the void left by Julian's absence. But what could he say? Julian was gone, taken away by a system that even Victor Calloway's considerable influence could not entirely control. Victor had tried. He had called in favors, sent lawyers, and pulled every string at his disposal. Yet, in the end, nothing could be done. That realization terrified Clara, for if even Victor, so powerful and cunning, could not change their fate, what hope remained for the rest of them? In the days that followed, Clara withdrew into herself. She stopped speaking to Victor, not with anger or dramatic farewells, but simply by cutting off contact. Victor, recognizing the futility of further insistence, allowed her the space she needed. Months passed, and though Clara managed to survive in the foster home that Victor had arranged for her, a place where she attended school, ate regular meals, and slowly began to rebuild a semblance of a normal life, she could not forget that surviving was not the same as truly living. One day, as she walked alone through the labyrinthine streets of Westvale, Clara found herself at a busy crosswalk. The city buzzed around her, indifferent to the struggles of its inhabitants. A man, his clothes threadbare and his eyes tired from a lifetime of hardship, stood at the curb with his hand outstretched, silently asking for help. The passers-by ignored him, their eyes fixed ahead as if he were invisible. Clara hesitated for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a single dollar bill. Without a second thought, she placed it into the man's outstretched hand. There was no test, no ulterior motive, just a simple act of kindness in a world that had long taught her to keep her distance. The man blinked in surprise, his weathered face softening for just a moment as he murmured, "Bless you, kid." Clara nodded once, then stepped off the curb and continued on her way, not turning back. For the first time since Julian had been taken away, she felt a stirring of resolve, a small, tentative hope that perhaps, despite all the pain and loss, she could begin to move forward. In the towering skyline and crowded streets of Evershade, there are people fighting silent battles every day, not for fame or fortune, but for something far more human: family, dignity, and the simple dream of living with integrity. Julian gave up his freedom to protect his sister. Clara, despite all she had lost, still chose kindness in a world built on calculation. And Victor Calloway, a man defined by power and precision, revealed a flicker of compassion no one saw coming. This story leaves us with a question. In a world full of trials, is kindness a weakness, or is it the greatest strength we have? What about you? If you were Julian, would you sacrifice your freedom for someone you love? If you were Clara, would you hold on to your values or compromise to survive? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might be the spark someone out there needs to believe in humanity again.